All right, we're going to get started, and I'm hoping that this recording will work properly, and so we can move on. Okay, good. Stephanie, I'm glad you could hear. All right, well, I'm glad you're all here tonight. We invited everyone from the course, and we invited some folks from the outside via Twitter and our blog, and so we might get some folks from out the class to show up here tonight. Just some quick mechanical details before we get started. I have control of the mic, but any of you can talk at any point if you want. All you need to do is either put your mouse on the talk button and hold it down, click on it and hold it down while you talk, or you could simply just hold the control key and that will allow you to talk. So later on when we ask questions, if you want to be able to speak and ask a question or just say something, you have the right to talk by using the talk button. All right, any questions before we get going? If you have a question, I'm going to clear the quick check area here. Okay. If you have any questions throughout the course of the evening, you can feel free to raise your hand by clicking on the little hand icon underneath the list of people, and I'll take those questions when appropriate. And you can also just kind of throw questions in the chat area and feel free to help each other as this is going on. So all of that aside, I want to welcome our special guest, Dr. Tom Brewster. I'm going to just let Tom introduce himself. You see a little description of him there on the screen, but Tom, why don't you just kind of quickly introduce yourself? Uh-oh, Tom, you there?
I've got to hold down the talk button. Okay. I'm Tom Brewster from Bluefield, Virginia, which is in the far reaches of Southwest, right along the southern border of West Virginia. In fact, I'm about a half a mile away from the West Virginia state line, which is north of me. I'm currently Deputy Superintendent in Pulaski County Public Schools. My area is administration and curriculum and instruction. Recently, we revised the title to academic support because kind of best reflected what our responsibilities were within the department. I did serve on the State Board of Education for 4 years. I was appointed by Governor Kane in 2006 and served until this past January 2010. So I just wanted to give you a brief description, and at that point I'll let you ask questions or let Dr. Becker ask questions.
Okay, Tom, so how did it come to be that you were appointed by Governor Kane to the state board?
It's interesting. I had met Governor Kane several times as lieutenant governor and governor, particularly when he traveled out in this direction, when he traveled out to Tazewell County, which is the county where I live. During that time, I'd had several interactions with him. The first interaction during his gubernatorial race was a small town hall meeting to discuss preschool education. So after the meeting was over, we engaged in a very brief conversation on the importance of preschool education, and I think it was his first opportunity to pitch preschool, the expansion of preschool education in the Commonwealth to the constituents out in that direction. Once he was elected governor, I simply applied to the Secretary of Commonwealth's office for the position. But I also had a really strong advocate in Senator Philip Puckett, who had met with the governor at some point during January when, briefly after the inauguration and talked to the governor personally. But having known the other side of the story, and of course I know Dr. Becker knows Mark Emblich, who is also an affiliate professor there. Mark sort of let me in on, some of the dialogue that was taking place between the governor, the Secretary of Education, and the state superintendent. And usually the governor makes these kinds of appointments in consultation with the Secretary of the Commonwealth, the Secretary of Education, and the state superintendent. The governor involves whomever he chooses to involve in that process. But at the time, the Secretary of Education, who was Tom Morris, was the former president of Emory and Henry, and he was promoting a superintendent from the Washington County area that had recently retired, and so as Dr. Emblich recounts, I wasn't even on the radar. The governor came in and presented, my name to the group, and at that point, there was a long delay between the time I heard from the governor and the time when I was actually appointed. He contacted me, and the first question he had, are you willing to put in the time, because this is going to take a lot of time, a lot of commitment, and a lot of travel. One thing about coming from the southwestern part of the state is you're looking at a 5-hour trip to Richmond, probably up to two times a month. So the first question he had was, are you committed to coming out to Richmond and serving on the board? And the second question, which was probably the most important question, is the fact, is your employer willing and to allow you to come out to Richmond, twice a month, and to keep up with what's a very hectic schedule. And of course, at the time, the answer to both of those questions were yes. However, in the aftermath, I did, check with my employer at the time, which was Concord University, and double check to make sure that was okay and it wasn't a problem. But of course, the application was submitted to the Secretary of Commonwealth's office, but of course it does help to have someone to advocate on your behalf, whenever your name is presented to the governor.
Okay, so Tom, you mentioned the kind of time commitment. So what's a day or a week in the life of a state board member like?
You would be surprised. You get very few phone calls. In fact, I think the most phone calls that I received during the 4 years on the board was when we were revising special education regulations. That was the most active that I had seen, constituents. And when I say constituents, these are citizens, parents, and such, actively engaged in the process was during the time we were looking at the SPED regulations. For the most part, there are two meetings. There's an evening meeting or a dinner meeting that you attend once a month, and then the next day, of course, is the formal board meeting. Most of the time, during that period, we had committee groups, that would meet in the afternoon. We would have, either public hearings, forums, or informational type sessions on very specific targets. And these targets were aligned with the governor's education agenda. So we sort of took a thematic approach to, some of our afternoon sessions, our work sessions, based upon what the governor's priorities were, one of which was the competence to excellence piece. Another was the expansion of preschool education. So, we had that meeting in the afternoon. For the most part, it was very rare that that you heard from the press. The opportunity to talk to the media usually was handled, by the president of the board. However, every now and then, someone locally, either from the Bristol paper or the Bluefield paper, would contact me with a comment about a particular press release. But for the most part, all the communication was handled, from the DOE. And not to talk a little bit about public hearings, probably the most important opportunity that we as board members had was to attend public hearings. And, I was surprised, out in Southwest Virginia, there were some hot topics where those public hearings were very well attended. However, there were some areas where you would expect a lot of people to show up, or you would expect people to be engaged in the process, and they weren't. There was hardly anyone to show up. So, I always tell people, one of the most important things that they can do, besides be actively involved in a professional group or organization, is to attend those public hearings, because, a lot of policy is shaped just by virtue of the amount of input that comes from the public. I've seen special education regulations change. I've seen other things that were controversial, where people showed up in mass, or people, submitted lots of public comment, and the board listened and made adjustments and revisions and changes. So, there was a lot of work involved. There was a lot of reading. I often commented, in the very beginning, it was as if you were drinking constantly from a fire hose, because there was so much information. And I had come from a public education background, so, I can't imagine how it would be for a citizen board member and someone that didn't have that affiliation and wasn't familiar with all the acronyms that gets thrown at you constantly. But it was just amazing that there was just so much information coming down all at once. Eventually, you learn to specialize. You learn, strengths and weaknesses of the other board members, and so that creates a dialogue. Where you feel like a board member has a particular knows a lot about a particular issue, then you certainly listen to what they have to say, and they normally have their finger on the pulse. So, but it was a very busy 4 years. There was a lot of traveling involved. I really took advantage of the national organization, which was called NASB, the National Association for State Boards of Education. I served on their board of directors for 2 years, and then chaired a study group on dropout prevention. But I found that kept me connected to national issues that were affecting the Commonwealth, and it also allowed me to connect with other state board members from across the country. And one thing that I found, no matter what our political disagreements were, at the heart and soul of those conversations was what was best for kids and what was best for students. And so I met all kinds of different board members from across the spectrum, from all the way out to Hawaii. We had a group of state board members. Hawaii has one board, and that's their state board. And they would fly in, to Washington for our NASB meetings all the way from Hawaii. And they were certainly excited every time they came in to connect with board members from the mainland. So it was very interesting to get out and network with those individuals, because it gave you a larger perspective on what was going on in the national issues.
All right, thanks. So, Roger, I think you had a question. Grab the mic, just hold down the talk button and ask a question.
Good question, Roger. I think a lot of it has to do with, the old saying is, I'm not going to go down and speak because they're going to do whatever. And that's not true. We had, one of the things that we could count on was there was a few core teachers out here in the Southwest that would show up and speak every time, just about every issue, because they recognized the importance of networking, because, the state board, does make a lot of important decisions. And a lot of things that gets handed down, either gets handed down from the General Assembly or gets handed down from the state board whenever it comes to public education. I think a lot of it is, from the general community or the community at large is not understanding, the role that the State Board of Education plays and how it impacts their child or their student in the classroom. Teachers the same way. A lot of times, they rely on the professional organizations to lobby for them, and that's great. Professional organizations do an outstanding job of making sure that we're aware of the issues and how they affect teachers, how they affect principals, how they affect, support staff, how they affect counselors. But there's nothing like hearing, from a parent, nothing like hearing from a classroom teacher who's directly affected by decisions that are made by the State Board of Education. So I think a lot of it is, people are very busy. For one, people don't understand, the role that the State Board plays, and how important it is that, when you do get that audience to lobby them on issues. And three, just the general communication about, meetings that are scheduled in the area. For example, we would usually hold one public hearing out in the southwestern part of Virginia. A lot of times it bordered right along, I-81 corridor, which is, anywhere from Blacksburg to Abington and that stretch. So, we have a lot of rural isolated areas here. But I think it was that way in other places as well. Northern Virginia would draw a lot of people, particularly when, special education regs were being discussed. But, when something, like, the math standards or, something, and I'm trying to think of, something that wasn't very well attended. When those issues come up, there was just not very much interest from the public at large.
So Tom, Mary, who I guess goes by Victoria, is asking a question about or is pointing out that a lot of educators don't really understand the State Board, and part of what we're doing this week in the class is just trying to figure out what is the role of state government and specifically the role of the State Board of Education. So, from your perspective, if a classroom teacher said to you, "What's the role of State Board of Education in, the general policy arena?" How would you answer that question?
I think, setting the cut scores, determining and approving the content standards that are taught, of course, the standards of quality, and the standards of accreditation, staffing standards. Whenever we would revisit the standards of quality, and we would revisit that every 2 years, we did so with the knowledge of, we were hearing all of this great input about staffing standards, for counselors and for building principals and assistant principals and teachers. And one of the big issues was math coordinators, reading coordinators in the schools and increasing those standards. The only problem with that is, they had to be funded by the General Assembly. So we, during the second round of hearings, we really got to thinking that, we're going to keep going to the well, and we're going to keep asking for people. We're going to keep asking people for input on staffing standards. But every time we go to the General Assembly, funding's, a major issue. I think what we did, I guess the last time we reviewed the SOLs, what we did was we prioritized some things. And I think one of the things that come out of that was, data coordinators and ITRTs, which, it's not the same thing, but it gave the divisions a choice of, whether to, use an ITRT or use a data coordinator, and to have that choice between the two. And of course, that's not always a choice that school systems want to make because they're equally important. But most of the time it was very difficult, particularly during the 4 years I served with the economy and such, to get things through, and fund it through the General Assembly. But, most of your regulations, the standards of accreditation, which sets accreditation standards for schools, comes from the Board of Education, the Virginia Index of Performance, which is the new Competence to Excellence Governor's Award that, recognizes schools for going beyond the minimum standards. That was designed and developed and approved by the State Board of Education. And also, one of the things that drives the State Board of Education is the comprehensive plan. And I think it's so important that, the right priorities be established in that comprehensive plan. So, I know we always stressed that we felt like that local boards should align their comprehensive plan with our comprehensive plan because we were all trying to hopefully achieve the same thing. So, just the design of that comprehensive plan and charting the course for public education in the Commonwealth was another important task that the state board was responsible for.
Okay, Tom, so related to that, one of the common complaints amongst educators is that all these important policy decisions are made by people who, quote unquote, don't really understand. And so you mentioned that you served alongside some citizen board members. What's your perspective on that, and what was it like working with folks who, didn't quite have an education background but were making important policy decisions?
The ones that, and I will say this, during Mark Warner and Tim Kaine's administration, most of the appointees had some affiliation to public education. Of course, you had Andy Rotherham, who has a unique national perspective on things. Andy was, someone that, worked in the Clinton administration, had, just a unique perspective on public education and education reform. And, Dave Johnson was the former executive director for the Virginia Education Association. Gary Jones had worked in the Reagan administration in the Department of Education under Terrell Bell. Mark Emlich was affiliated to the Literacy Foundation there at VCU and Communities in Schools. Eleanor Saslaw was a former counselor. Isis Castro was a Spanish teacher, and I could go on and on. But most everyone there had, either contact or close proximity to public education and understood, certainly understood the board's role. We did have a few citizen board members, and they were very bright. They caught on very quickly, but they also listened. If it was a particular area where someone on the board had an expertise, they were always willing to reach out, listen to the individual when they spoke about that particular topic. And I could tell you, we had, I think we had a very good working relationship on the board, and just tried to help everyone understand the issues, related to whatever we were advocating for. But I think that, if you're a citizen board member, one thing is to be a good listener. One thing is to be very studious and read the materials, and do research on your own, and also, to be mindful that, you are one of 9 members. So everyone has an opinion. Everyone has a particular area of expertise. So it's always a good idea to do more listening than talking.
Okay, so now talk a little bit, if you would, about the relationship between the State Board of Ed, the State Superintendent, and also the Secretary of Education, who's different now than it was when you were serving, and this current Secretary probably has a slightly different approach. But talk a little bit about the Board of Ed, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, the Department of Ed, and then also the Secretary of Ed, and kind of how you all work with, or in some cases opposed to each other.
Sure. The one thing about the Secretary of Education is their responsibility is to push the agenda of the governor, to push it in the General Assembly, and to push it within the Department of Education. And I think the general feeling is within the Department of Education is when you work there, you work for the governor, and you work for the Board of Education. One of the things that certainly strengthens the role of Secretary of Education, or makes it stronger than it has been, is the P16 Council, which consists of representatives from higher ed, community colleges, and public education. But for the most part, we had very limited interactions with the Secretary of Education. I think, the board president and the state superintendent interacted regularly because it was the state, Secretary of Education's job to ensure that the governor's priorities were, being implemented, or to advocate for the governor's priorities. And sometimes, the governor's priorities different from that of the state boards, or that of, the department or the direction state board's going in. At times, from what I've understood during different administrations, that's been very problematic. But I think Governor Kane was always interested in, and of course we were always represented by Mark Emlich, but the governor was always interested in the state board's perspective, and of course he had certain non-negotiables, and we knew what those were. But for the most part, he was very open to what we had to say. But any type of regulation that went through the board had to go through the governor's office. Also had to go through the Secretary of Education's office. So we were very mindful that we needed their support, in order to make things happen. The state superintendent works very closely with the board. She has an executive staff which consists of, the assistant superintendent for assessment, curriculum and instruction, policy and communications, special education and student services, and then testing and assessment. And we work very closely with those assistants, and we work very closely with the state superintendent. But the person that we worked and interacted with the most, was probably one of the most influential, or is probably one of the most influential individuals there, is Margaret Roberts, who's the executive assistant to the board. And Margaret works, of course, in the Department of Policy and Communication. But I called Margaret one day, with just a question, and I said, Margaret, I'm sorry I'm bothering you. This is the third time today I've called you. I said, but I just want to make sure of something. And she said, my job is your job. I'm employed entirely to answer your questions and to make sure that you have all the information and the materials and the resources that you need in order to do your job and be successful. So we interacted, as board members, the board president interacted a lot with the state superintendent. We interacted a lot with Margaret. One of the things, if we had an issue or concern, we could always, contact Mark Emlich. We always went through the board president, which we felt like was the appropriate channel, and we would talk with him about any issues that we might have, because, like any good president, no one wants to be blindsided during a board meeting with an issue that they didn't see coming. So one of the interesting things in that whole dynamic was our evening meetings, our dinner meetings, and I'll tell you that I'll tell you something. Dave Johnson remarked, he's the former executive director for the VEA, but of course, the VEA does a lot of lobbying and they show up at various board meetings, particularly the VEA president. But Dave's comment was, if I'd known this much, it's a public meeting, the dinner meeting the night before, but if I'd known this much business was discussed, I'd been coming here instead of going to the day meeting. So, the evening meeting was an opportunity for board members to ask questions and get clarification and, interact with one another and interact with the president and the superintendent about, what's coming up on the agenda and any issues that they might have.
So during your time on the board, you went through a transition from one state superintendent to another. Is that correct?
That's correct. The interesting thing is, we started out with Pat as the interim superintendent, and then of course Governor Kane named Billy Kennedy as the superintendent from Chesterfield County, and then of course Dr. Kennedy left and went to the University of Virginia, and so Pat was serving as deputy superintendent. So Pat was at that point elevated up to state superintendent.
And what was that transition like? Was it at all Did it all complicate the work of the board?
It didn't complicate the work of the board, and I will tell you, Dr. Kennedy was very much a visionary. Dr. Wright is an institutional person. She had a great deal of institutional knowledge. So that combination, when Dr. Kennedy was state superintendent and Dr. Wright was deputy superintendent, was a great combination. And he would remark many times that he was so fortunate to have her as deputy because she had just a very good understanding of the General Assembly, had a very good understanding of the department and the direction the department had been going in. So when Dr. Kennedy left, the governor appointed Dr. Wright, who was very much involved in the day-to-day operations of the division. So I think the transitions that occurred during that 4-year period between Dr. Wright, Dr. Kennedy, and then back to Dr. Wright was probably, very smooth. I didn't see any issues at all with the transition there.
Can you, so Candy's asking a little bit about I guess it's actually a P16 council. Can you say a little bit about the P16 council?
Sure. I think, and I want to say, either P21 or P16 councils are popping up, just about everywhere, all over the country, in order to get, the various levels communicating with one another and interacting and collaborating. One of the issues that's been talked about and discussed is the fact that, sometimes, public ed doesn't know what community colleges are doing. Community colleges that, they don't know what's going on in public ed, and there's opportunity to collaborate between the three groups. So the P16 Council was formed to develop that collaboration. And I think a lot of initiatives have come from that collaboration on P16, from the P16 Council. I never served. I attended a couple of meetings, but I do know that it was an opportunity for the chancellor, the state superintendent, the board president, the community college president, the SHEV executive director, to all get involved and the with the Secretary of Education and talk about education issues, collaboration, and transition.
So, Tom, I was at, as you may know, I was at a conference a couple weeks ago called EDUCON, which is to some degree a conference about school reform and school change, but it's heavily tech-oriented. But one of the sessions that I facilitated was about kind of advocacy and how folks can affect change. And one of the points that I tried to emphasize was that it's one thing to complain sort of in social media spaces or other places about the direction of educational policy. But the best thing you can do if you want to affect change is to get to know those who are in positions to affect change. So what would you say to educators who want things to be different in education? What's the best way to try and make that change? Is it approaching board members directly or legislators? If a classroom teacher, let's say, wanted to make their voice heard on a particular issue, wanted someone at the state level to hear that voice, what's the best way to do that, in your opinion?
I think, and I talked about this with Sue Magliero, because she was interested in the same thing. How can we increase our presence? And I think she was talking about her group, our presence with the state board, and get our ideas out there. One of the things I suggested is have someone from your group or organization attend every board meeting and get to know the board members. So whenever you email or whenever you talk with that particular board member, they understand and that they know who you are. They understand where you're from, and and they understand what kind of issues you're trying to advocate for. One of the groups, Just Children, was an advocacy group that was there at every single board meeting. And of course, they're very, their presence is abundant in the General Assembly as well. But I think, attending the public hearings in your local area and speaking every opportunity that you get to speak is important, particularly if you're a classroom teacher and you can't make the journey to Richmond, on a monthly basis. I also think, being very active in your professional group and organization is extremely important, because there's someone there that can, assist you with, getting to these board members, that has probably built up relationships with board members, with members of the General Assembly that can advocate on your behalf, and can take the opportunity to speak with one voice, your opinions on change and education reform, because, one of the things that, I've said over and over again, if I had known how important the public hearing process was, as an educator and, as a principal and as a, college professor, I would have been participating in every one of them, because there you have a board member one-on-one that's willing to listen to your comments and such. And, you've got their attention, and they usually stick around afterwards to listen and interact. There were a couple of public hearings where, I did the public hearing pretty much in the audience, surrounded by about 4 or 5 people who were talking to me directly. And you better believe that, what they said, registered and resonated with me. One of the things, one of the interesting calls, I did get a call from a professor at one of the, for one of the teacher education programs in the area, and she was complaining about a decision that the state board had made. And, by the time we make the decision, it's too late, and one of the things that I talked with her about was, whenever something like this comes up, you need to let me know during the public comment period, and find out when that public comment period is, and let me know. Send me an email. Send Margaret Roberts an email, who's the executive assistant to the board. If she gets the email, she's going to make sure that all the board members receive that email. But I will tell you, all public comment gets compiled. The department reviews it, and then it goes to the state board. It usually gets compiled in a big notebook. So that's why I think it's important to go to the public hearing so they can hear firsthand, because sometimes it's very difficult, particularly on a contingent issue, to review that big, everything that's in that big notebook. But if you reach out to board members directly, their addresses are online. If you reach out to them directly through email, or you reach out to them through Margaret, and you would say, please ensure that board members receive this, then they're going to receive it, and they're going to read it they're more likely to read it as if you submitted it to Department of Education. I'm not saying they don't, board members wouldn't necessarily read the material, but there's an awful lot of it, if there's a particular contentious issue.
Okay, so Roger asks a question about, with the current budget shortfall and stimulus funding drying up, do you think the role of the board will change, and how might this affect the board's influence in shaping policy?
Yeah, that's interesting. I went through, I was interim superintendent last spring during probably one of the worst budget years that you could imagine, where we had to, cut 69 positions. And it's so tough, particularly when you have young teachers that have so much hope and promise, and have to go through the RIF. And fortunately, we were able to bring a lot of them back. But our first concern, besides the fact that they were going to lose their job and their livelihood, our next concern was that the fear that we're going to lose a generation of teachers. Either because we can't pay them enough, or through the elimination of their position. one of the things the board can do, the board does not have funding power. That goes to, that rests solely and strictly with the General Assembly. But one thing that the board can do is continually advocate for a world-class education system that requires proper education funding. And I think the state board's role is one from a bully pulpit of setting the priorities, and advocating for the General Assembly to appropriate the money to ensure that those priorities get happen and get set in the public education setting. So that's probably the most important role that they have is interacting with the General Assembly, just like all citizens, and encouraging more spending for public education.
Thank you. So, as I said, we're trying to kind of work through the role of states in education, and one of the folks in the class is Tara McDaniel, who now works in the Virginia Department of Education. Tara wrote on our blog that she kind of sees the role of the State Department of Ed as kind of a liaison between the federal government and the local education agencies or the school divisions. And Tara, you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but is that kind of how you see the role of the state? And that may be more specific to Virginia than in other states, but I guess if you could speak a little bit to the role of the state within the larger system between the federal and local control.
Sure. First of all, I see the Department of Education as being a resource to assist, public schools, local boards, and local school systems, meet those standards, meet those federal benchmarks and federal standards. And, one of the things that, one of the areas that I think Virginia excels in is, in the area of school improvement and that process of, getting on the ground and, and at least providing, not only, resources, technical assistance for schools that are struggling with meeting AYP, but also providing them with a process. And I know that process can be sometimes frustrating and cumbersome for local school divisions, but it has been, proven to work, and I've seen that process work, within my own division. One of the things that I, really haven't talked about is, the local boards have a lot of power, and they have a lot of authority. And, and although the State Department of Education, and the federal government has the mandates, it's up to the, local board to, prioritize the budget, prioritize the spending, and ensure those mandates are met. One of the things that we talked about, it's a little different, between Virginia and West Virginia is, West Virginia, they will take over a school system and seem to have no problem doing it. One of the neighboring counties over in West Virginia, McDowell County, has been taken over. And I have a friend that works over there as a CAG, which is a closing the achievement gap specialist, and works within that school division to try to assist them with meeting AYP. But one of the things that's kind of interesting, I think, that was said to me was, if you take it over, you own it. And, the state of West Virginia has owned McDowell County for 10 years now. And the only thing that I think the county has to show for it is, two new schools. And that's it. So, one of the things that I certainly appreciate about the school improvement process and how, the Virginia Department of Education works with school systems is they don't go in and try to take it over. What they do is they try to get resources and assist those school divisions with, with meeting those state standards and provide them with the necessary technical assistance and on-the-ground assistance to get that job done. And, of course, we had several school divisions, under memorandums of understanding, while I was on the board. Of course, Richmond City came off, I think, right when I was on the board or came onto the board, but we also had, Petersburg and right now I'm drawing a blank on the other school division that we had, under a memorandum of understanding. But, those school systems, particularly Petersburg, would have to come to the board periodically and report on their progress. But, as far as, the question was, why does Virginia or why does the Commonwealth not take over school systems? And I think take it over on it. And sometimes that's a tall order for a department that's very stretched very thin on resources, the amount of resources that they have.
Tom, were you on the board when the decision was being made around whether Virginia would adopt the Common Core standards or not?
I was actually, in the process of coming off the board at that particular time. So, we were discussing, signing on. But I think the actual, decision was made and followed through after I came on the board.
Yeah, I mean, I asked because that's sort of a good kind of case study to understand the role of the states. Here's the federal, well, not the federal government as much as a federal initiative or a nationwide initiative, and states opting in or not. And I think ultimately, well, at least publicly declared that they've been they think their standards are just fine, right? And so they don't need these Common Core standards. And in fact, their standards are better than the Common Core standards, and so they're going to stick with what they got and do their own thing that way. So it's been an interesting case study in how it thinks of itself with respect to the larger educational system.
Yeah, that's right. We've, I think the thought has been that, we've put, 16 years into the development and the refining of these content standards and our standards of learning, and we're not, about to drop what we have in place, for newly developed national standards. The Virginia way, so to speak. I've heard that said several times too. But I think that was, as I was coming off the board, this was, certainly being discussed, and we had actually applied, or had approved, my last year approved applying for the first round of Race to the Top funds. When I came off the board, of course, that was when the applications for second round. The call for the second round of applications took place. But you're right on the mark there. And I'll tell you, there was a point, and I served on NASB's board of directors, and we were having a discussion on, content standards and national standards. And, at the time it was, I think it was about 2.5 years ago when national standards were first being talked about and discussed, and a little less than 2 years ago. But one of the things, I wasn't sure where I stood on national standards at the time. But one of the things that I told the rest of the group from NASB is, regardless of how I feel about national standards or any of us feel about national standards, we need to be at the table. And if NASB decides, or the national group decides, that they don't want to participate in a conversation on national standards, then the chief state school officers in the National Governors Association is going to be there, going to capitalize on it. We're going to be left out in the cold. State boards are going to be left out in the cold. So in the conversation that we had, it was decided that, yes, NASB needed to be an important part of that conversation, and I think NASB's taken the ball and run with it as far as promoting national standards, to its state board members. I know Brenda Wilburn told me, she's the executive director for the National Association for State Boards. She's told, representatives from the Obama administration, she's told Arne Duncan, and she's told, some of the governors, that, if you want content standards, if you want national standards, then the road to national standards goes through or runs through state boards of education. So I think they've got a pretty healthy seat at the table right now in that movement.
So I told him I wouldn't keep him more than an hour, and most of these folks have to get up early in the morning and go help kids learn. So we won't go more than 10 minutes, and I could certainly keep asking questions, but hopefully some others will have some questions, but I don't see any. So let me just ask another question, which is, kind of about the evolving role of it with respect to local education agencies. And you mentioned your work on the National State Board Association, and I imagine you got to interact with colleagues there who are on state boards that are in states that are much more actively setting policy than Virginia. You mentioned West Virginia, where I happen to have done a bunch of work, and I know that they just do a lot more in a kind of way. Did you find those conversations sort of illuminating to talk with folks who are in states where they have a little bit more kind of power and leverage than maybe in Virginia?
Yes, and I got particularly close to the West Virginia board because, I would drive up to Lewisburg and then ride to Washington in the car with about four of them, and there was a lot of conversations on what was going there with the 21st century skills, their work with 21st century skills. They had looked at innovation zones, and I don't think that ever got through the General Assembly. But, just talking to them about some of their work and some of their initiatives and some of their work with, Dr. Payne, their former state superintendent. But yes, I've really enjoyed those conversations. I enjoyed particularly listening to, state board members with different perspectives than what I was used to, hearing in Virginia. And, I think one of the things that, serving on a study group or serving, on a national group allowed me to do was hear perspectives that, normally I wouldn't have, been familiar with, just staying within the borders of Virginia. And, if you want to talk about, individuals with differing views, of course, when Andy was on the board, Andy was very much, for education reform. He was a charter school advocate. So it was always fascinating to even talk to, to colleagues like Andy, who had a different perspective on education reform and certainly one that I respected. So it was very interesting to hear those conversations and to listen to other state board members and what they were doing within their states.
Okay, looks like Roger's up again. So he says, after working on the board at the state level and dealing with the challenges of establishing standards that apply at the state level, do you think that national standards would be able to be defined in a way that would be practical, logical, and broad enough to meet the needs of the nation's youth during a time of transition? So perhaps say a little bit more about your feelings about national standards versus state level standards.
Yeah, Roger, you did recognize that I did skirt that issue somewhat, because I'll be perfectly honest with you. I did feel like Virginia needed to have a seat at the table, and really needed to be involved in that process. From the simple standpoint, I felt like we had something to offer. I think as a state we have something to offer when it comes to setting content standards. And in listening to some of my fellow board members across the country, some of the things that they would say is, we have an opportunity to, set objectives for mathematics, because what a student should know as a result of instruction in the area of mathematics should be the same in Tennessee as it is in Virginia. So, I actually warmed up to the idea of national standards, but, I think we have a seat at the table, and we have something to offer. As a Commonwealth, we have something to offer. But then, if we can't buy into them at that point, then we have a decision to make. But, we should be definitely part of the process. But, of course, I think part of the arrangement for applying to, for Race to the Top, the second round was, signing on to the content standards. So, I don't know if we could have made that full commitment, but I think we should have been at the table.
Okay, so I guess my final question to you, Tom, would be how, if at all, has your time and your service on the State Board of Education influenced you now as a district administrator? Did we lose Tom there?
I think it's made me more aware of the role that I have as an advocate not only for the students within my own division, but an advocate that I have, particularly, for my region. I think it certainly made me more vocal, about, education issues. It's made me more knowledgeable. There was a great deal of, I felt like the experience gave me a great deal of growth in that, not only respecting differing opinions, but also, when you listen, you sort of adopt some of those ideas. But it was a very, very rewarding experience, those 4 years. And I do feel like that we accomplished a lot, but there's a lot left on the table. So, that's one of the disappointing things about, at the end of the 4 years it was over, because I felt like there was still a lot, there on the table. But, administrations change, perspectives change, and board members change. So.
Well, thanks, Tom. We've hit the sort of hour mark, so I want to kind of conclude there, and I hope my students and other colleagues who joined me here will offer you kind of a virtual thank you. And if you hit the little emoticon sign, you can kind of clap for Tom and do it that way. So. Oh wait, Angela, did you have a question, or were you just wanting to, or did you want to clap?
You will let.
I was trying to.
I saw Chad Ratliff there. You'll let anyone into this session, won't you?
Yeah, even those Albemarle people, we'll let them in.
Yeah, I saw that. I've definitely enjoyed this. It's been great, and I know I've kind of rambled. Have a lot of thoughts, and sometimes this late at night it's hard to get those out. But I certainly appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks, Tom. And I'll also add for the students in here who are kind of tinkering a little bit with Twitter, although I owe them an email about Twitter. But if you want to follow Tom on Twitter, he's there, and he is EduBrew. That's EduBrew. It's at Edu, and you can follow Tom and see what he has to say and interact with him outside of this space and in that space. So thanks, Tom, and thanks everyone for being here. And I'm going to stop the archive, and I will see everyone in the cyber world.
Yeah, time for Parks and Recreation.